The fluorescent lights above flickered like dying stars as I pressed my palm against the cold metal door, feeling the vibrations of the hospital's ventilation system humming through the walls. David's hand, once strong enough to carry me over the threshold of our first apartment 25 years ago, now felt like paper beneath my fingertips, translucent, fragile, barely there. The machines surrounding his bed created a symphony of beeps and whirs that had become the soundtrack of our final days together. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the mechanical breathing that kept his lungs moving. I leaned closer, close enough to smell the antiseptic mingling with something deeper. The scent of a man I'd loved since college, now fading like morning mist. His eyes, those deep brown eyes that used to crinkle at the corners when he laughed at my terrible jokes, struggled to focus on my face. "I'm here, honey," I whispered back, stroking his graying hair. T-52, David should have had decades ahead of him. In our kitchen that had been dripping for months. But somehow, in this moment, there was an urgency in his gaze that I hadn't seen since his diagnosis 6 months ago. "The basement," he said, each word requiring tremendous effort. His grip on my hand tightened with surprising strength. "Check. The basement. Behind the water heater. There's a—" He coughed, a rattling sound that made my chest ache. "There's a reason. For everything." I wanted to tell him not to worry about the basement, not to think about home repairs or storage, or whatever project he'd left unfinished. But something in his expression stopped me. This wasn't about forgotten Christmas decorations or outdated tax documents. This was something else entirely. "David, what are you talking about? What's in the basement?" But his eyes had already begun to lose their focus, drifting towards something I couldn't see. Dr. Martinez, our oncologist, who had become like family over these months, stepped forward and checked the monitors with practiced efficiency. She was a small woman with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a neat bun, and she had a way of explaining medical complexities that made them seem manageable, even when they weren't. "Mrs. Henderson," she said softly, placing a gentle hand on my shoulder. "His vitals are declining rapidly. It won't be much longer now." My sister Lisa arrived just as the sun was setting, painting the hospital room in shades of amber and gold. She'd driven 3 hours from Portland, leaving her own family behind to be here with us. Lisa had always been the practical one, the sister who remembered birthdays and kept emergency supplies in her car. She took one look at David and immediately understood. "How long?" she asked Dr. Martinez quietly. "Hours, maybe less." Lisa pulled a chair beside mine and wrapped her arm around my shoulders. We sat in silence, watching David's chest rise and fall with mechanical precision. Somewhere in the hallway, a janitor's cart rattled past, and the sound seemed obscenely normal in a moment that felt anything but. It was just past midnight when the machines changed their tune. The steady beeping became irregular, then frantic, then finally gave way to a single, continuous tone that seemed to echo in my bones. Dr. Martinez moved with quiet professionalism, checking pupils with a small flashlight, listening with her stethoscope, making notes on a chart. But I knew before she turned to me with those kind, tired eyes. "I'm so sorry, Sarah, he's gone." The drive home felt surreal, like moving through water. Lisa insisted on coming with me, following in her own car so she could stay the night. Our house, David's house, our house, now just my house, sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac in a neighborhood where children still rode bicycles and neighbors still waved from their porches. David had loved this house from the moment we'd seen it, had spent countless weekends working on improvements and repairs, always talking about the, quote, potential he saw in its bones. The key stuck in the front door lock, as it had for the past 3 years. David had always meant to fix it, adding it to the ever-growing list of projects that retirement would finally give him time to complete. Retirement. The word felt bitter now, like spoiled milk. Inside, the house felt larger somehow, as if David's absence had created extra space in rooms that had always seemed perfectly proportioned. His coffee mug still sat in the sink from 4 days ago, when he'd insisted on making his own breakfast before we left for what turned out to be his final hospital stay. The sight of it, a blue ceramic mug with a chip on the handle from when he'd dropped it while laughing at something on the morning news, nearly broke me. "Sarah," Lisa said gently, "why don't you get some sleep? We can deal with everything else tomorrow." But I couldn't sleep. How could I sleep when David's last words kept echoing in my mind? "Check the basement. Behind the water heater. There's a reason for everything." What reason? What had he been trying to tell me? At 2:30 in the morning, I found myself standing at the basement door, my hand resting on the old brass doorknob that David had installed himself when we first bought the house. The basement had always been his domain, a workshop filled with tools I didn't recognize, boxes of components for projects I didn't understand, and that persistent smell of sawdust and motor oil that seemed to cling to his clothes even on days when he didn't go downstairs. The wooden steps creaked under my weight, the same creaks I'd heard countless times when David made his evening trips downstairs to tinker, as he called it. The single bulb at the bottom of the stairs cast harsh shadows across the concrete walls, making the familiar space seem foreign and threatening. The water heater stood in the far corner, a white metal cylinder surrounded by a maze of pipes and connections that had always seemed bewilderingly complex to me. David had explained the system to me once, pointing out the pressure relief valve and the temperature controls with the pride of a man who understood how things worked. But now, crouching behind the unit with a flashlight, I saw something I'd never noticed before. There was a section of the concrete wall that looked different from the rest, newer. The mortar between the blocks was a slightly different shade, and when I pressed against it, it gave slightly, as if there was empty space beyond. My heart began to race as I traced the outline with my fingers. A rectangle about 3 feet wide and 2 feet tall, perfectly concealed unless you knew exactly where to look. I ran back upstairs and returned with a hammer and chisel from David's toolbox, tools that felt foreign in my hands but somehow necessary. The mortar cracked more easily than I'd expected, crumbling away in chunks to reveal that the blocks weren't actually attached to anything behind them. They were just placed there, like a carefully constructed facade. When I finally worked the first block free, cool air rushed out from the space beyond, carrying with it the scent of metal and something else, something that reminded me of the bank vault, where we kept our important papers. With trembling hands, I removed the rest of the blocks, revealing a steel door set into a concrete frame. It looked like something from a movie, with heavy hinges and a combination lock that gleamed dully in the flashlight beam. But it was what I found taped to the inside of the doorframe that made my knees weak, an envelope with my name written in David's careful handwriting, along with a series of numbers that could only be the combination. "Sarah?" Lisa's voice called from upstairs. "Are you okay down there?" I clutched the envelope to my chest, suddenly terrified of what I might find inside. David had been many things: a loving husband, a patient teacher, a man who could fix anything that broke. But he had also been intensely private about some aspects of his life. There were phone calls he took in another room, business trips that seemed vaguely defined, and a way he had of changing the subject whenever I asked too many questions about his work at the consulting firm. "I'm fine," I called back, though I wasn't sure that was true. "Just checking on something David mentioned." The envelope contained 3 sheets of paper covered in David's meticulous handwriting, along with the combination to the vault. August 15th, 73, our wedding date. As I read his words by flashlight, my hands began to shake. "My dearest Sarah, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you've found what I've spent the last 15 years hoping you'd never have to find. I know this must be overwhelming, and I know you must have 1,000 questions. I wish I could be there to answer them, to hold your hand through what comes next. But some secrets are too dangerous to share while the person keeping them is still alive. What you'll find in this vault will change everything you thought you knew about me, about us, about the life we've built together. I need you to know that every moment of our marriage has been real. Every laugh, every fight, every quiet Sunday morning reading the paper together. That was David Henderson, the man who loves you more than life itself. But David Henderson isn't the only name I've carried, and consulting wasn't the only work I've done. Before I met you, I was someone else entirely, someone who made choices that seemed necessary at the time but that I've spent our entire marriage trying to atone for. What's in this vault represents both my greatest shame and my greatest gift to the future. Evidence of things that happened, people who were hurt, systems that were corrupted. Evidence that could help a lot of people get justice, but only in the right hands. I never told you because I wanted to protect you. Because I thought I could take these secrets to my grave, and they would die with me. But as I write this, knowing that the cancer is going to win, I realize that some knowledge is too important to bury. There are people who have been waiting decades for answers, families who deserve to know the truth about what happened to their loved ones. I'm trusting you with this because you're the strongest person I know, because you have a moral compass that never wavers, and because if anyone can figure out how to use this information responsibly, it's you. But Sarah, I need you to be careful. There are people who would kill to keep these secrets buried, and now that burden falls to you. The letter continued, but my hands were shaking too violently to read the rest. I could hear Lisa moving around upstairs, probably making tea and wondering what was taking me so long. Part of me wanted to run upstairs, wake her up, and tell her everything. But David's words echoed in my mind. There are people who would kill to keep these secrets buried. With fingers that felt disconnected from my body, I spun the combination lock. August 15th, 73. Click, click, click. The heavy door swung open with surprising silence, revealing a space about the size of a large closet. But what I saw inside made me stumble backward so violently that I nearly dropped the flashlight. The vault was lined with metal shelves, and every shelf was filled with files, photographs, computer drives, and documents organized with the same meticulous care that David brought to everything else in his life. But it wasn't just the quantity of material that shocked me, it was the nature of it. Even in the dim light, I could see government seals, classified stamps, and photographs that looked like surveillance images. On the center shelf, a manila folder labeled Operation Nightfall Final Report sat next to a stack of photographs that made my stomach turn. They showed men in military uniforms standing over what looked like a mass grave, and even in the poor light I could see the callous indifference in their expressions. Beneath the photos, a typed report began with the words, Casualty Assessment of Civilian Population, Village of San Cristobal, Guatemala, March 1982. Guatemala, 1982. I did the math quickly. That was 1 year before I met David, when he would have been 24 years old, the same age as some of the soldiers in the photographs. My legs gave out and I found myself sitting on the cold concrete floor of our basement, staring into a vault that contained evidence of horrors I couldn't even begin to process. This was why David had been so secretive, so careful about his past. This was why he'd sometimes woken up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat and unwilling to talk about his dreams. The man I'd loved, the man who'd held me through 3 miscarriages and celebrated with me through every small triumph of our life together, had once been part of something terrible enough to require a hidden vault full of evidence. But he'd also been the man who'd carefully preserved that evidence, who'd spent 15 years building a case for justice even while living with the knowledge that revealing it might destroy him. I reached for another folder, this one labeled simply Insurance. Inside, I found bank statements showing regular deposits to accounts I'd never heard of. Payments made to what appeared to be humanitarian organizations in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Nicaragua. Thousands of dollars, sent every month for over a decade, with memo lines that read Memorial Fund and Survivor Assistance. David hadn't just kept evidence of what had happened. He'd been quietly trying to make amends, using money from accounts I didn't even know existed to help the families of people who'd been hurt by operations he'd been part of. The consulting work, the business trips, the private phone calls, it had all been part of an elaborate system of penance that he'd carried out in silence. But there was more. Much more. As I pulled file after file from the shelves, a picture began to emerge of a network of operations that stretched far beyond Guatemala, involving people whose names I recognized from newspaper headlines and television interviews. Politicians, military contractors, business leaders, all connected by a web of shared secrets and mutual dependence that had persisted for decades. And at the center of it all was my husband, the man who'd taught me how to change a tire and who'd cried during every romantic comedy we'd ever watched together. David had been not just a participant, but apparently a key figure in operations that had affected thousands of lives across multiple countries and decades. The implications were staggering. This wasn't just about historical injustices or long-buried secrets. Some of the documents were dated as recently as 2 years ago, suggesting that whatever network David had been part of was still active, still making decisions that affected real people, in real time. As I sat on that cold basement floor, surrounded by evidence of a life I'd never suspected my husband of living, one thought kept racing through my mind. If David had been part of all this, and if these people were still active, then what did his death mean for me? Had the cancer really been natural? Or had someone decided that David Henderson knew too much and had become too much of a liability? And if that was true, then what did it mean that I now knew everything he'd known, and more? The grandfather clock in our living room chimed 3 times, its deep, resonant tone echoing through the house like a warning. Somewhere upstairs, Lisa was probably wondering what had happened to me, maybe even getting worried enough to come looking. But I couldn't leave this vault now. Not when I was only beginning to understand the magnitude of what David had left me. I reached for the thickest file on the bottom shelf, labeled Current Operations, Active Personnel. As I opened it, a loose photograph fell out and landed face-up on the concrete. It showed a group of men in business suits standing around a conference table, and even in the dim flashlight beam, I could make out David's face among them. But it was the date stamp on the photo that made my blood run cold. It was from just 6 months ago, right around the time David had first started complaining about feeling tired all the time. The coffee maker gurgled to life at 6:30 a.m., just as it had every morning for the past 15 years, triggered by the timer David had programmed and I'd never learned to adjust. The sound used to comfort me, a sign that our day was beginning together, that David would emerge from the shower with his hair still damp and reach for the mug I'd already prepared for him. Now it felt like a taunt, a reminder that some routines persist, even when the people who created them are gone. Lisa found me in the kitchen, still wearing the clothes I'd put on yesterday morning for the hospital. She took one look at my face and poured herself a cup of coffee without saying a word. My sister had always been intuitive that way, able to read the emotional temperature of a room the moment she entered it. "You didn't sleep," she said, settling into the chair across from me at our small breakfast table. It was a statement, not a question. "No." I wrapped my hands around my own mug, seeking warmth. "Lisa, what do you remember about David when I first brought him home?" She raised an eyebrow at the unexpected question. "That's a strange thing to ask right now." "Please, I need to know." Lisa studied my face with the careful attention of someone who'd spent a lifetime reading her younger sister's moods. "He was careful," she said finally. "Polite, charming, obviously crazy about you. But careful, like he was thinking about every word before he said it. Mom thought he was too good to be true. She kept waiting for the other shoe to drop." Too good to be true. The phrase hit me like a physical blow. "What did you think?" "I thought he was running from something," Lisa said quietly. "The way he never talked about his family, never mentioned old friends or college stories. It was like his life began the day he met you. But then I figured, hell, maybe that's what love does to people. Maybe he was just completely focused on building a future with you." "Baisal." I stared into my coffee, watching the cream swirl in patterns that reminded me of storm clouds. What if it wasn't that simple? "Sarah, what's going on? You've been acting strange since we got home from the hospital. And don't tell me it's just grief. I know what grief looks like, and this is something else." Before I could answer, the doorbell rang. Through the frosted glass of our front door, I could see the silhouette of a person in a dark suit. My heart began to race as I remembered David's warning. There are people who would kill to keep these secrets buried. I opened the door to find a woman in her 40s with steel gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, and the kind of perfectly pressed suit that suggested either government employment or expensive legal representation. She had the bearing of someone accustomed to being obeyed, but her eyes were kind, the eyes of someone who delivered difficult news many times before. "Mrs. Henderson?" "I'm Agent Patricia Williams, with the Federal Bureau of Investigation." She held up a leather wallet containing a badge and official identification. "I'm very sorry for your loss. I wonder if I might have a few minutes of your time. Lisa appeared behind me, coffee mug still in hand. Is everything all right? Agent Williams glanced between us. Mrs. Henderson, is this a convenient time to talk privately? What I need to discuss with you is rather sensitive. The word sensitive sent a chill through me. How much did the FBI know about what was hidden in our basement? Had they been watching David? Watching me? My sister can hear anything you need to tell me, I said, though I wasn't entirely sure that was true. Agent Williams nodded and stepped into our living room, her eyes scanning the space with professional interest. She noted the family photos on the mantelpiece, the stack of medical bills on David's desk, the general atmosphere of a house where normal life had been interrupted by illness and death. Mrs. Henderson, your husband worked as a consultant for various government agencies over the course of his career. I'm sure you're aware of that. I nodded, not trusting my voice. What you may not be aware of is that some of his work involved classified operations, projects that, for reasons of national security, have never been made public. Lisa moved to stand beside me, and I could feel her tension like heat radiating from her body. What exactly are you saying? Agent Williams focused on me. I'm saying that your husband possessed information that could be damaging to ongoing operations if it fell into the wrong hands. We have reason to believe he may have kept records, files, documentation of his work. The blood rushing in my ears was so loud I was surprised they couldn't hear it. What kind of records? The kind that certain hostile foreign governments would pay handsomely to obtain. The kind that could compromise current agents in the field, or reveal methods and sources that are still being used today. Agent Williams leaned forward slightly. Mrs. Henderson, did your husband ever mention anything about keeping files? A home office, perhaps, or storage unit? Somewhere he might have kept materials from his consulting work? I thought about the vault, about the photographs of mass graves and the lists of active personnel. I thought about David's letter, about his warning that there were people who would kill to keep these secrets buried. Was Agent Williams one of those people? Or was she genuinely trying to protect national security? No, I said, the lie coming out more smoothly than I'd expected. David never brought work home. He said it was important to keep boundaries between his professional and personal life. Agent Williams studied my face with the practiced eye of someone trained to spot deception. I see. Well, if you do come across anything, files, computer disks, even handwritten notes, it's important that you contact us immediately. These materials could put you in serious danger if the wrong people learn you have them. After she left, Lisa and I sat in the living room in stunned silence. Finally, Lisa spoke. Sarah, what the hell was that about? And don't you dare lie to me the way you just lied to her. I looked at my sister, Lisa, who'd driven 3 hours to be with me, who'd slept in our guest room for the past week, who'd handled the funeral arrangements I'd been too overwhelmed to deal with. Lisa, who had 2 teenage daughters and a husband who needed her at home, but who'd stayed anyway because she knew I needed her more. If I tell you, I said slowly, I might be putting you in danger. More danger than lying to federal agents? She had a point. And as I sat there, looking at the family photos that showed decades of holidays and anniversaries and ordinary moments that now seemed impossibly precious, I realized that keeping David's secrets alone might be more than I could handle. Last night, I found something. I told her everything. About David's last words, about the vault behind the water heater, about the files and photographs and evidence of operations that had destroyed entire communities. I told her about the money David had been sending to survivor assistance funds, about the network of people who seemed to still be active, about my growing fear that David's cancer might not have been as random as we'd believed. Lisa listened without interruption, her face growing paler with each detail. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Show me, she said finally. We went down to the basement together, and I watched Lisa's face as she saw the vault, as she read David's letter, as she examined the files that painted a picture of systematic violence carried out by people who'd then gone on to build successful careers in politics and business. Jesus, Sarah, she whispered, holding a photograph that showed a village church with bodies scattered in front of it. How many people knew about this? That's what I've been trying to figure out. Look at this. I showed her the file labeled Current Operations, with its lists of names and locations and what appeared to be ongoing mission assignments. Some of these people are still active, still making decisions that affect people's lives. Lisa picked up a document that appeared to be a meeting summary from just 8 months ago. And David was part of these meetings, even after he got sick? It looks that way, which makes me wonder, I trailed off, unable to voice my worst suspicion. You think someone killed him? Lisa's voice was flat, matter of fact. You think they poisoned him or somehow gave him cancer because he knew too much? I don't know, maybe I'm being paranoid. But Lisa, look at this timing. I pulled out David's medical records, which I'd kept in meticulous detail. His first symptoms appeared right after that photo was taken, right after that last meeting. And Agent Williams showing up here the day after he dies? That's not a coincidence. Lisa was quiet, studying the documents with the analytical mind that had made her a successful accountant. Okay, she said finally. Let's say you're right. Let's say David was killed because someone thought he was becoming a liability. What does that mean for you? It means I know everything he knew and more. It means I'm now the liability. We spent the next several hours going through the files systematically, creating an inventory of what David had preserved. The scope was staggering. Operations in Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Honduras, all during the 1980s, all involving the systematic targeting of civilian populations suspected of supporting communist insurgencies. But it wasn't just Central America. There were files on activities in Southeast Asia, the Middle East, Eastern Europe. Decades of operations carried out by a network of people who'd then seamlessly transitioned into respectable careers in government, business, and academia. And all of it documented with David's characteristic attention to detail: dates, names, locations, casualty figures, budget allocations. It was a historian's nightmare and a prosecutor's dream, if anyone was brave enough to use it. But perhaps most disturbing were the files showing how this network had evolved over time, adapting to changing political circumstances while maintaining its core mission of protecting American interests through whatever means necessary. The methods had become more sophisticated, the operations more deniable, but the fundamental approach remained unchanged. Look at this, Lisa said, holding up a document dated just 2 years earlier. This is a planning memo for something called Operation Clean Sweep. It talks about eliminating potential sources of historical embarrassment and ensuring operational security through permanent resolution of legacy risks. Legacy risks. People like David, who'd carried the secrets for decades and might eventually decide that justice was more important than personal safety. I thought about David's quiet philanthropy, his monthly donations to survivor assistance funds, his careful preservation of evidence that could bring justice to families who'd been waiting 40 years for answers. Had that been enough to mark him as a legacy risk? Sarah, we need help, Lisa said. This is bigger than we can handle alone. Who can we trust? Agent Williams might be legitimate FBI, or she might be part of this network trying to find out what we know. The people David was working with obviously can't be trusted. And if we go to the media without being careful, we might just end up getting more people killed. Lisa was quiet for a moment, then pulled out her phone. I know someone, she said. Remember my college roommate Jennifer Torres? She's an investigative journalist now, works for the Washington Post. She's done stories on government corruption, military contractors. If anyone would know how to handle something like this safely, it's her. I wanted to say yes immediately. The burden of carrying these secrets alone was already overwhelming, and it had only been 1 day. But David's warnings echoed in my mind. There are people who would kill to keep these secrets buried. What if contacting her puts her in danger too? What if not contacting her means all of this stays buried forever? Sarah, look around you. Look at what David saved. This isn't just about justice for things that happened 40 years ago. This is about stopping things that are happening right now, today. She was right, but the weight of that responsibility felt crushing. David had carried it for decades, had found a way to live with the knowledge of what he'd been part of, while quietly working to make amends. But he'd also been part of the system, had understood its rules and power structures in ways that I never could. I was just a woman who'd spent the last 23 years teaching high school English, who'd never been involved in anything more politically complex than a school board election. What did I know about navigating the world of classified operations and government secrets? But then I thought about my students, teenagers who trusted me to help them understand literature that often dealt with moral complexity, with characters facing impossible choices between personal safety and ethical responsibility. How many times had I taught them that the most important moments in life are when we choose between what's easy and what's right? Call Jennifer, I said. But Lisa, once we do this, there's no going back. Once we start this process, we become part of whatever happens next. Lisa squeezed my hand. We're already part of it, Sarah. The question is whether we're going to let David's sacrifice mean something, or whether we're going to let fear win. As she dialed Jennifer's number, I looked around the basement that had been David's private workshop for so many years. All those evenings when he'd come down here to tinker, he'd actually been organizing evidence, maintaining files, building a case for justice that he'd never been able to present. But maybe that had been the point. Maybe David had known that someone else would have to finish what he'd started. Someone who wasn't compromised by having been part of the original operations. Someone who could approach these revelations with the moral clarity of an outsider. Someone like me. The phone rang twice before Jennifer answered, her voice carrying the harried tone of a journalist working on deadline. But when Lisa explained that she needed help with a story that involved classified government operations and potential ongoing criminal activity, Jennifer's tone sharpened with professional interest. "How soon can you get to Washington?" Jennifer asked after Lisa had given her a brief overview. "Is tomorrow too soon?" Lisa replied, looking at me for confirmation. "Tomorrow's perfect. But Lisa, if this is as serious as it sounds, you need to be careful. Don't talk about this on the phone, don't send anything electronically, and don't tell anyone else where you're going or why. Can you do that?" After Lisa hung up, we sat in silence for several minutes, both understanding that we'd just crossed a line from which there was no return. Tomorrow, we'd drive to Washington and hand over evidence that could topple careers, trigger congressional investigations, and potentially put us both in serious danger. But tonight, we were still just two sisters in a suburban basement, trying to figure out how to honor the memory of a man whose life had been far more complex than either of us had ever imagined. "Do you think he knew?" Lisa asked quietly. "Do you think David knew he was dying when he put all this together?" I thought about the careful organization of the files, the detailed instructions he'd left, the way he'd prepared me to find the vault, even while hoping I'd never have to. "I think he knew he might die," I said, "and I think he wanted to make sure that if he did, these secrets wouldn't die with him." As we turned off the basement light and headed upstairs, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the darkened window. I looked like a woman who'd aged years in the span of a single day, which, I supposed, was exactly what I was. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tonight, I was still just Sarah Henderson, widow and high school teacher. But by this time tomorrow, I'd be something else entirely. The keeper of secrets that could reshape history, and the woman brave enough, or foolish enough, to believe that justice was worth the risk. The drive to Washington felt like traveling through a landscape of memories that belonged to someone else's life. Every mile marker, every rest stop, every familiar chain restaurant represented a distance not just from home, but from the person I'd been just 48 hours earlier. Lisa drove while I sat in the passenger seat, clutching a briefcase that contained photocopies of the most damning documents from David's vault. Insurance, David had called it in one of his notes. The originals remained hidden in our basement, but even these copies felt like they were burning through the leather case. Jennifer Torres met us at a small cafe near DuPont Circle, a place that buzzed with the constant conversation of Washington professionals conducting business over overpriced coffee. She looked older than I'd expected from Lisa's college stories, silver streaks in her dark hair, laugh lines around her eyes, and the slightly weary expression of someone who'd spent years investigating stories that most people preferred to ignore. "Before we begin," she said after the introductions, "I need you to understand what you're potentially getting into. If what Lisa described to me is accurate, you're not just talking about historical injustices. You're talking about ongoing criminal enterprises involving people with enormous resources and very few scruples about protecting themselves." I opened the briefcase and handed her a folder containing some of the most straightforward documentation: meeting minutes, budget allocations, personnel assignments. Jennifer examined them with the practiced eye of someone who'd learned to spot authentic documents among the flood of fabrications that found their way to investigative journalists. "This is real," she said after several minutes, her voice carrying a mix of excitement and apprehension. "Sarah, do you understand what you have here?" "I'm beginning to." Jennifer spread several documents across the small table, arranging them chronologically. "This isn't just about operations in Central America during the 1980s. Look at these dates. Some of this activity continued well into the 1990s, and these personnel files suggest that many of the same people are still active in government and private sector roles." She pointed to a document that showed budget allocations for something called domestic monitoring operations. The dates were from just 3 years ago, and the amounts involved were staggering. Millions of dollars directed toward what appeared to be surveillance activities targeting American citizens. "Jennifer," Lisa said, "what exactly are we looking at?" "You're looking at evidence of a shadow network that has been operating outside normal government oversight for decades. These people have been involved in everything from assassination programs to drug trafficking to domestic surveillance. And based on what I'm seeing here, they're still active." A young man at the next table glanced in our direction, and Jennifer immediately began gathering up the documents. "Not here," she said. "This conversation needs to happen somewhere more private." 20 minutes later, we were sitting in Jennifer's apartment, a comfortable space filled with the controlled chaos of someone who lives surrounded by ongoing investigations. Stacks of documents covered every surface, whiteboards along the walls displayed timelines and connection charts for various stories, and multiple computer screens flickered with news feeds and research databases. "Okay," Jennifer said, settling into a chair across from us. "Let's start from the beginning. Tell me about your husband." I told her about David. Not just the man I discovered after his death, but the man I'd lived with for 23 years. His kindness, his careful attention to detail, his way of listening to my stories about difficult students, with the same focus he brought to everything else in his life. I told her about his nightmares, his periods of withdrawal that I'd attributed to work stress, and his quiet philanthropy that I was only now beginning to understand. "He was trying to make amends," Jennifer said when I finished. "These monthly payments to survivor organizations, the careful preservation of evidence. He was building a case while simultaneously trying to help the people who'd been hurt by the operations he'd been part of." Jennifer pulled out a laptop and began cross-referencing names from David's files with her own research databases. Within minutes, she'd pulled up news articles, corporate biographies, and government appointment records that painted a picture of remarkable success for many of the people David had worked with. "Look at this," she said, pointing to the screen. "Colonel Marcus Webb listed here as participating in Operation Nightfall in Guatemala. He's now CEO of Blackwater Defense Contractors, one of the largest private military companies in the world. Annual revenues of over $2 billion. She clicked to another profile. "General Patricia Hawkins, also listed in your husband's files. She served as Deputy Secretary of Defense under 3 different administrations and is currently on the board of directors for 6 major defense contractors." The pattern was clear and disturbing. The people who participated in operations that had resulted in thousands of civilian deaths hadn't been punished or marginalized. They'd been promoted, celebrated, and rewarded with positions of even greater power and influence. "But here's what's really interesting," Jennifer continued, pulling up another document. "Some of these people are still working together. Look at this corporate structure chart for something called Strategic Solutions International. It's supposedly a consulting firm. But look at the personnel." The names were familiar from David's files. People who'd worked together in Central America during the 1980s, now reunited under the banner of a private company that provided security consulting services to governments and corporations around the world. "They never really left," I said, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. "They just moved from official government operations to private contractors. And with far less oversight," Jennifer added. "Private military contractors operate in a legal gray area. They can do things that official military units can't do, go places where the U.S. military can't officially operate." Lisa had been quietly studying the documents while Jennifer and I talked, Now she looked up with an expression of growing alarm. Sarah, look at this list of current contracts. The document she handed me showed Strategic Solutions International's active projects, security operations in mineral-rich regions of Africa, population management services in Central Asia, and something called infrastructure protection in South America that seemed to involve substantial military assets. They're still doing it, Lisa said, just in different places with different targets. Jennifer nodded grimly. And based on the dates in these files, your husband was still receiving briefings on these operations right up until he got sick, which means he knew exactly what was happening, and he was documenting all of it. I finished. The implications were staggering. David hadn't just preserved evidence of historical crimes. He'd been building a real-time case against ongoing operations that were affecting people around the world today. And if the people running these operations had discovered what he was doing? Jennifer, I said, is it possible to poison someone in a way that would look like cancer? She was quiet for a long moment. There are substances that can cause cancer-like symptoms very rapidly. Radioactive materials, certain chemical compounds. But proving that someone was deliberately poisoned months after the fact would be nearly impossible, especially if the person doing the poisoning had access to sophisticated methods and resources. We spent the next several hours going through David's files systematically, with Jennifer taking detailed notes and occasionally stopping to make encrypted phone calls to sources she wouldn't identify. Gradually, a picture emerged of a network that was far larger and more sophisticated than I'd initially realized. It wasn't just about a group of former military officers who'd formed a private company. This was a web of relationships that extended into Congress, the Pentagon, major corporations, and even academic institutions. Universities that received grants to study population dynamics in regions where Strategic Solutions International operated. Think tanks that published policy papers supporting the exact types of interventions that these operations carried out. News organizations that consistently reported on conflicts in ways that justified military contractor involvement. This is how they've stayed hidden for so long, Jennifer explained. They've created an entire ecosystem of support. People who benefit financially from their operations, others who provide intellectual justification for their methods, and still others who shape public perception of the conflicts they're involved in. As the afternoon wore on, Jennifer's expression grew increasingly troubled. She'd made several more phone calls, each one leaving her looking more concerned than the last. "We have a problem," she said finally. "I've been checking with my sources about some of the people named in these files. 3 of them have died in the past 18 months. The room fell silent except for the distant sound of traffic from the street below. Died how? Lisa asked. Natural causes, officially. Heart attack, stroke, car accident. But all 3 were people who might have had access to the same kind of information your husband preserved. And all 3 died shortly after retiring from active involvement in government contracting. The pattern was becoming clear, and it was terrifying. David hadn't just been building a case. He'd been part of a group of people who'd apparently decided that the time had come to reveal the truth about decades of illegal operations. And now, one by one, those people were dying. How many others were there? I asked. Jennifer consulted her notes. Based on what I'm seeing in these files, maybe 8 or 10 people who had access to the complete picture. Your husband was one of them, obviously. The 3 who died. That leaves maybe 5 or 6 people who might still be alive and might still have evidence. Or might still be in danger, Lisa added. Definitely still in danger. Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. Are you absolutely certain that no one else knows you have these files? I thought about Agent Williams' visit, about her careful questions regarding whether David had kept records at home. The FBI agent who came to see me was asking about exactly this kind of material. She said they were concerned about classified information falling into the wrong hands. Describe her. I gave Jennifer the details I could remember. Agent Williams, appearance, her badge number, the specific questions she'd asked. Jennifer made notes, then picked up her phone and made another call. When she hung up, her face was grim. There is no Agent Patricia Williams currently assigned to the FBI's Washington field office. The badge number you gave me was issued to an agent who died in 2018. The coffee I'd been drinking suddenly tasted like ash. So who was she? Someone who wanted to find out what you know and how much of a threat you represent. The fact that they sent someone to your house so quickly after your husband's death suggests they're taking this very seriously. Lisa stood up and began pacing around Jennifer's living room. This is insane. We're talking about people who have killed multiple individuals to keep their secrets, and now they know that Sarah has access to everything David preserved. We need to go to the police, the real FBI, someone in authority. And tell them what? Jennifer asked. That we have evidence of government crimes involving people who are still in positions of power? Lisa, some of the people named in these files are currently serving in Congress, running major corporations, advising presidential campaigns. They have resources and connections that we can't even imagine. I felt like I was drowning in the enormity of what we'd uncovered. Just 3 days ago, my biggest worry had been planning David's funeral and figuring out how to live alone in a house full of memories. Now I was apparently the target of people who killed to protect secrets, possessing evidence that could implicate some of the most powerful people in the country. What do we do? I asked. Jennifer was quiet for a long moment, studying the documents spread across her coffee table. We have 2 choices, she said finally. We can try to find a way to release this information safely, which will require building a coalition of journalists, attorneys, and possibly international organizations willing to take on this level of risk. Or we can destroy everything and hope they leave you alone. And if we choose the second option, then David's 20-year effort to document these crimes was meaningless. The people responsible for thousands of deaths continue to operate with impunity, and there's no guarantee they'll leave you alone anyway. They might decide you're still too much of a risk, even without the evidence. The weight of the decision felt crushing. But as I sat there looking at photographs of mass graves and reading testimonies from survivors who'd waited decades for justice, I thought about my students again, about the literature we'd studied together, about characters who'd faced impossible choices between personal safety and moral responsibility. And I thought about David, working alone in our basement for years, carefully organizing evidence that he hoped would one day bring justice to people who'd been forgotten by the world. If we go forward with this, I said, what exactly are we getting into? Jennifer pulled up a secure messaging application on her laptop. First, we need to get you somewhere safe. These people know where you live, and they've already sent someone to evaluate what kind of threat you represent. We need to assume they're monitoring your communications and possibly conducting surveillance. She began typing rapidly. I have contacts at organizations that specialize in protecting whistleblowers and investigative sources. There are safe houses, secure communication methods, legal protections we can put in place. But Sarah, once we start this process, your old life is over. You'll never be able to go back to being just a high school teacher in suburban Virginia. Lisa sat down beside me and took my hand. I'll stay with you, she said. Whatever you decide, I'll see it through. I looked at my sister, this woman who'd already sacrificed so much to be here with me, who had a family and a life that she'd be putting at risk if we continued down this path. Lisa, you have daughters. You can't. My daughters are going to inherit the world that these people are creating, she interrupted. If we don't stop this, if we let them continue operating without consequences, what kind of future are we leaving for the next generation? Jennifer's phone buzzed with a response to her message. She read it quickly, then looked up at us. I can have someone here in 2 hours to get you to a secure location. But I need to know now. Are you committed to seeing this through, whatever the cost? I thought about David's letter, about his trust that I would know what to do with the information he'd preserved. I thought about the families in Guatemala who'd been waiting 40 years for justice, and about whatever operations Strategic Solutions International was conducting right now, in real time, that might be creating new victims. Yes, I said, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. We're committed. Jennifer nodded and began making arrangements. As she worked, Lisa and I sat quietly, both understanding that we'd just committed ourselves to a path that would either result in justice for thousands of victims or get us both killed. But for the first time since David's death, I felt like I was honoring his memory in a way that mattered. He'd spent decades carrying these secrets alone, working quietly to document crimes and help survivors, while living with the knowledge that revealing the truth might destroy him. Now it was my turn to carry that burden, and unlike David, I wouldn't have to carry it alone. The safe house was a nondescript townhouse in Arlington, Virginia, indistinguishable from dozens of others in a neighborhood where young professionals lived anonymous lives commuting to jobs in downtown Washington. But the ordinary appearance was deceptive. The windows were bulletproof, the doors reinforced with steel, and every room contained security equipment that looked like it belonged in a spy movie rather than suburban Virginia. Marcus Chen, the security specialist Jennifer had contacted, was a compact man in his 50s with graying hair and the alert posture of someone who'd spent years in dangerous situations. He'd introduced himself simply as someone who helped people in difficult circumstances, but the way he swept the house for surveillance devices and checked sight lines from every window suggested his background was considerably more complex. "Your friend Jennifer wasn't exaggerating," he said after reviewing David's files. "This is the kind of information that governments go to war to protect or obtain. The people you're dealing with have essentially unlimited resources and very few moral constraints." It had been 4 days since Lisa and I left our house, and in that time Jennifer had been working around the clock to verify David's information and build a network of journalists, attorneys, and human rights organizations willing to help us reveal the truth. The picture that emerged was even more disturbing than what I'd initially understood. "We've confirmed the identities of 23 people named in your husband's files who are currently serving in senior government positions," Jennifer reported during one of our daily briefings. "Another 15 are running major corporations, and at least 8 are involved in presidential campaign organizations." She pulled up a secure presentation on her laptop. "But here's what's really significant. We've been able to cross-reference your husband's documentation with information from other sources. There are survivors, Sarah. People who witnessed these operations and have been trying to get justice for decades." The screen showed photographs of men and women from Guatemala, El Salvador, and Nicaragua, people whose villages had been destroyed, whose families had been killed, whose lives had been shattered by operations that David had helped document. But they were alive, and they were willing to testify about what they'd experienced. "How many?" I asked. 17 so far, scattered across 3 countries. But they're scared, understandably. They've been trying to get attention for their stories for decades, and nobody in power has been willing to listen. Several have been threatened, and a few have survived assassination attempts." Marcus looked up from the security monitor he'd been watching. "Which is why we need to move carefully. Once we start revealing this information publicly, everyone involved becomes a target. The survivors, the journalists, the attorneys, and, obviously, the 2 of you." Over the past 4 days, I'd been learning about a world I'd never known existed. Networks of investigative journalists who specialized in exposing government corruption, international human rights organizations that documented crimes against humanity, and attorneys who spent their careers pursuing justice for victims of state-sponsored violence. It was a community of people who dedicated their lives to revealing truths that powerful people preferred to keep hidden. But it was also a community that had paid a price for that dedication. Jennifer introduced me to reporters who'd been harassed, threatened, and in some cases physically attacked for their work. Attorneys who'd had their licenses threatened and their families intimidated. Human rights workers who'd been forced to flee their home countries. "This is what we're asking you to become part of," Jennifer said one evening as we reviewed security protocols. "Sarah, you need to understand that once we publish this story, your life will never be private again. These people will try to discredit you, investigate every aspect of your past, and if that doesn't work, they'll escalate to more direct methods." I thought about my students, about the quiet life I'd built teaching teenagers about literature and helping them prepare for college. That life already felt like it belonged to someone else, someone who died along with David 4 days ago. "What about Lisa?" I asked. "She has children." Lisa, who'd been quietly reviewing witness statements from Guatemala, looked up. "My children are 15 and 17 years old, Sarah. They're old enough to understand why this matters. And they're old enough to live with the consequences of doing what's right." On the 5th day, Jennifer received a call that changed everything. One of her contacts at the International Criminal Court in The Hague had reviewed preliminary information about David's files and wanted to discuss opening a formal investigation into crimes against humanity. "This is huge," Jennifer explained. "If the ICC takes jurisdiction, it means the investigation will be conducted by an international body with subpoena power and the ability to issue arrest warrants. It also means that the people involved can't just use their influence within the U.S. government to make this disappear. But it also meant escalating our situation to an entirely new level. An ICC investigation would generate international media attention and put pressure on governments around the world to cooperate with the inquiry. The people we were exposing would be facing not just embarrassment or career consequences, but potential prosecution for war crimes. They'll come after us with everything they have," Marcus warned. "Once this becomes an international criminal matter, the stakes change completely." That evening, as I sat in the safe house reviewing statements from survivors who'd waited 40 years to tell their stories, my phone rang. The caller ID showed my home number. Marcus gestured for me to answer while he activated recording equipment. "Be careful what you say." "Hello? Mrs. Henderson, this is Agent Williams. We spoke the other day about your husband's work." The woman's voice was exactly as I remembered, professional, slightly concerned, with an undertone of authority. But now I knew she wasn't FBI, and her presence in my house had been part of an effort to determine what threat I represented. "Agent Williams, how did you get this number?" "Mrs. Henderson, I need you to understand that you're in serious danger. The information your husband preserved has put you at risk from foreign intelligence services, who would like very much to obtain those files. We can protect you, but we need you to come in immediately." I looked at Marcus, who was furiously typing notes on his laptop. He held up a sign that read, "Keep her talking." "What kind of protection are you talking about?" "A secure facility where we can keep you safe while we determine the extent of the threat. Mrs. Henderson, there are people who will kill you for what you know. The only way to ensure your safety is to place these materials in proper government custody and relocate you to a protected environment." Creating this investigative story required extensive research and countless hours of work. If you're finding this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more true stories. For how long? There was a pause. That would depend on the security assessment, possibly indefinitely. The meaning was clear. They wanted to disappear me, to lock me away somewhere. I could never reveal what David had discovered. It would be presented as protective custody, but it would effectively be imprisonment. "I need time to think about this." "Mrs. Henderson, time is something you don't have. We know you're not at your house, which suggests you understand the seriousness of the situation. But wherever you are now, you're not safe. These people have resources you can't imagine." "I'll call you back," I said, and hung up. Marcus immediately began checking his security monitors more carefully. "They're probably trying to trace that call. We need to assume our location is compromised." Within 30 minutes, we were packing up and moving to a new location, a cabin in the mountains of West Virginia that belonged to an organization Jennifer described only as people who help journalists in dangerous situations. As we drove through the night, Lisa and I talked about what Agent Williams had offered: protective custody, relocation, a new identity. It was a way out, a chance to walk away from all of this and disappear into a life where David's secrets couldn't put us in danger. "Are you tempted?" Lisa asked. "Part of me is," I admitted. "The part that just wants to be safe, that wants to go back to worrying about lesson plans and parent conferences, instead of international criminal conspiracies. But David trusted me with this for a reason. He could have destroyed these files before he died. He could have taken these secrets to his grave and let sleeping dogs lie. Instead, he made sure I would find them, made sure someone would finally reveal the truth." The cabin was isolated, surrounded by thick woods that would make surveillance difficult. But it also felt like we were withdrawing from the world, hiding in the mountains, while victims continued to suffer and perpetrators continued to profit from their crimes. Jennifer had driven separately, and when she arrived, she brought news that changed our perspective entirely. "We've been contacted by survivors, organizations in 4 different countries," she reported. Word is spreading that someone finally has documentation of the operations that destroyed their communities. Sarah, they're asking to meet with you. They want to thank you for preserving their stories. She showed me letters and emails from Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Honduras. Messages from elderly men and women who remembered the day soldiers came to their villages, who'd lost children and spouses and siblings to operations that had never been officially acknowledged. One letter, translated from Spanish, was from a woman named Carmen Delgado, whose village had been destroyed in 1983. She wrote, "For 39 years, I have been telling people about what happened to my family, about the soldiers who came in the night and killed my husband and my oldest son. No one with power ever listened, no one with authority ever cared. But now, maybe, someone will finally believe us. Maybe my husband and son will not have died for nothing." Reading that letter, sitting in a cabin in the West Virginia mountains, I finally understood what David had been carrying all these years. It wasn't just guilt about his participation in these operations. It was the weight of being one of the few people who could provide justice to families like Carmen Delgado's, and the terrible responsibility of knowing that revealing the truth might cost him his life. "I want to meet with them," I said, "with the survivors. I want to hear their stories directly." Jennifer nodded. "I was hoping you'd say that. But it means traveling internationally, which increases our security risks significantly." Marcus, who'd been monitoring communications equipment, looked up. "There's something else you need to know. We've been tracking communications traffic related to your case, and there's been a significant increase in activity over the past 24 hours. Multiple government agencies are involved now, as well as several private security firms." "What does that mean?" "It means they're escalating their response. The phone call from fake Agent Williams was probably just the first attempt to bring you in voluntarily. If that doesn't work, they'll try other methods." As if summoned by his words, the secure satellite phone Jennifer had been using began to ring. She answered it carefully, speaking in a code that Marcus had taught us for identifying legitimate contacts. When she hung up, her face was pale. "What is it?" Lisa asked. "That was my editor at the Post. 2 hours ago, FBI agents raided the newspaper's offices with a warrant related to stolen classified materials and threats to national security. They seized computers, files, and phone records. The entire investigative team has been suspended pending a security review." The message was clear. The people we were exposing had enough influence to shut down major news organizations, at least temporarily. They could use the power of federal law enforcement to investigate and intimidate anyone who tried to help us. But they'd also revealed something important. They were scared enough to take these kinds of drastic actions, which meant they understood exactly how damaging David's evidence could be. "This confirms it," I said. "Everything David documented is true, and it's significant enough that they're willing to risk exposing themselves to suppress it." Jennifer was already making arrangements for alternative publication strategies, international news organizations, human rights publications, and digital platforms that would be harder for U.S. authorities to control. But as I sat in that cabin, reading letters from survivors who'd waited decades for someone to believe their stories, I realized that publication was only the beginning. David had preserved evidence of crimes, but evidence alone wouldn't bring justice. That would require institutions willing to investigate, prosecutors willing to bring charges, and juries willing to convict. And all of those institutions were potentially compromised by the same network of people who'd been protecting these secrets for decades. "Jennifer," I said, "what happens if we publish everything and nothing changes? What if we reveal all of this and the people responsible still face no consequences?" She was quiet for a moment. "Then at least the survivors' stories will be heard. At least the families who lost loved ones will know that someone finally believed them. And at least future generations will have a record of what happened, even if justice is delayed." It wasn't the answer I'd hoped for, but it was honest. And as I thought about Carmen Delgado's letter, about her 40-year struggle to get someone to listen to her story, I realized that sometimes bearing witness is its own form of justice. David had spent the last 20 years of his life bearing witness, documenting crimes that others wanted to forget. Now it was my turn to ensure that his witness, and the testimony of survivors like Carmen Delgado, would not be silenced. 3 months after David's death, I stood in a courtroom in The Hague, Netherlands, watching as Judge Elena Ramirez called the International Criminal Court to order for the preliminary hearing in the matter of the prosecutor versus Marcus Webb et al. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, but the gravity of the moment was unmistakable. Behind bulletproof glass sat 9 defendants, former military officers, government officials, and corporate executives whose careers had been built on the foundation of the operations David had documented. Marcus Webb, the former colonel who'd become CEO of Blackwater Defense Contractors, sat perfectly still as the charges were read. Crimes against humanity, war crimes, and conspiracy to commit genocide. His face showed no emotion, but I could see his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the edge of the defendant's table. The journey to this moment had been harrowing. After the FBI raid on the Washington Post, Jennifer and her network of investigative journalists had worked with international news organizations to publish David's evidence simultaneously in 12 countries. The story had broken on the same day in London, Paris, Berlin, Mexico City, and 8 other cities, making it impossible for U.S. authorities to suppress the information. The international response had been immediate and overwhelming. The governments of Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Honduras had formally requested ICC investigation into crimes committed against their citizens. European Parliament members had called for sanctions against the individuals involved. Human rights organizations had filed complaints with multiple international bodies. But the personal cost had been enormous. Lisa and I had been living under protection for months, moving between safe houses as security threats escalated. My house had been broken into twice, my bank accounts frozen under various legal pretexts, and my former colleagues at school had been questioned by federal agents. The life I'd known was gone, replaced by an existence defined by security protocols and constant vigilance. Lisa's daughters had been relocated to stay with their grandparents, and her marriage was under tremendous strain. The decision to support me had cost her family dearly, but she'd never wavered in her commitment to seeing this through. "It's worth it," she'd said one evening as we reviewed our security arrangements for the 10th time that week. "When I think about those survivors finally getting their day in court, when I think about preventing future operations like this, it's worth everything we've sacrificed." The survivors had been extraordinary. Carmen Delgado, now 74 years old, had traveled from Guatemala to testify before ICC investigators. Despite her age and the obvious difficulty of reliving traumatic memories, she'd spent 3 days providing detailed testimony about the massacre in her village, identifying photographs from David's files, and explaining how the operations had affected her community for decades. "Your husband, he saved our stories," she'd told me through a translator. "For 40 years people said we were lying, that these things never happened. But your husband, he kept the proof. He made sure someone would believe us." There had been 17 survivors who'd provided testimony, each one adding pieces to a puzzle that revealed the scope and systematic nature of the operations David had participated in. Their courage was humbling. People who'd lived with trauma for decades, who'd been threatened and marginalized for trying to tell their stories, now finally having their voices heard by an international tribunal. But the defendants weren't accepting their fate quietly. Marcus Webb's legal team had filed dozens of motions challenging the court's jurisdiction, claiming that the operations in question had been legitimate military actions authorized by the United States government. They'd hired some of the most expensive international lawyers available, and launched a media campaign portraying the defendants as patriots being persecuted by anti-American international bodies. More disturbing were the unofficial responses. 3 of the survivors who'd agreed to testify had received death threats, and one had been forced to relocate after his house was burned down. Jennifer had been subjected to a campaign of harassment that included invasive surveillance, death threats, and attempts to discredit her professionally. And there had been more deaths. 2 more people from David's network had died in what were officially termed accidents: a car crash in Virginia and a heart attack in Maryland. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. People who possessed information about these operations were dying at a statistically impossible rate. "They're cleaning house," Marcus Chen had explained during one of our security briefings, "eliminating anyone who might provide additional evidence or testimony. It's both an attempt to protect themselves and a warning to others who might be considering coming forward." But the ICC investigation had reached a point where additional deaths couldn't stop the legal process. David's documentation had provided the foundation for charges, and the survivor's testimony had filled in the human details that made the crimes impossible to dismiss as abstract policy decisions. Judge Ramirez was now reading the court's preliminary findings, and her words carried the weight of international law. This court finds sufficient evidence to conclude that the defendants engaged in a systematic and widespread attack against civilian populations, carried out as part of a deliberate policy to eliminate perceived threats to government stability in multiple Central American nations. The legal language was dry, but the implications were revolutionary. For the first time in history, an international tribunal was formally recognizing that operations carried out by U.S. military and intelligence personnel constituted crimes against humanity. In the gallery behind me, I could see Carmen Delgado and several other survivors listening to the translation with expressions of profound relief and vindication. These were people who'd been told for decades that their stories didn't matter, that the deaths of their families were acceptable casualties in larger geopolitical struggles. Now an international court was declaring that their suffering had been the result of criminal acts that violated the most fundamental principles of human dignity. But I also knew that this was only the beginning. The preliminary hearing was just the first step in a legal process that could take years to complete. The defendants had enormous resources and would fight every aspect of the charges. There would be appeals, procedural challenges, and diplomatic pressure from governments that preferred these secrets to remain buried. After the hearing, Jennifer and I met with the lead prosecutor, Dr. Sarah Okafor, a Nigerian attorney who'd spent her career pursuing justice for victims of war crimes. She was cautiously optimistic about the strength of the case, but realistic about the challenges ahead. "Your husband's documentation is extraordinary," she said. "I've been prosecuting these kinds of cases for 15 years, and I've never seen evidence this comprehensive. But you need to understand that the defendants will use every legal and political tool available to them. This trial could last for years, and they'll try to discredit every witness, challenge every document, and delay every proceeding." She paused, studying my face. "Sarah, I need to ask you directly, are you prepared for that? Are you prepared to have your life scrutinized, your credibility attacked, your husband's memory questioned? Because that's what they'll do." I thought about David's letter, about his trust, that I would know how to use the information he'd preserved responsibly. I thought about Carmen Delgado and the other survivors who'd waited decades for someone to believe their stories. And I thought about my students, about the literature we'd studied together that taught us that moral courage requires sacrifice. "Dr. Okafor," I said, "David carried these secrets alone for 20 years. The survivors have been fighting for justice for 40 years. If they can endure that, I can endure whatever comes next." The months that followed were a whirlwind of legal proceedings, media interviews, and security concerns. The story of David's hidden vault had captured international attention, and I found myself becoming the reluctant face of a movement demanding accountability for decades of covert operations. The response in the United States was polarized. Some praised my courage in exposing government crimes, while others accused me of treason and undermining national security. Congressional hearings were held, with some representatives calling for stricter oversight of covert operations, while others demanded that I be prosecuted for revealing classified information. But perhaps the most significant development was the response from within the intelligence and military communities themselves. Encouraged by the international attention and legal protections offered by the ICC investigation, other former operatives began coming forward with their own evidence of illegal activities. A former CIA analyst provided documentation of drug trafficking operations used to fund covert activities. A retired Army colonel revealed evidence of assassination programs that had targeted journalists and human rights workers. A State Department official disclosed diplomatic cables, showing how embassies had been used to coordinate operations that violated international law. The trickle of revelations became a flood, and it became clear that the operations David had documented were part of a much larger pattern of illegal activity that had persisted for decades. Each new revelation strengthened the ICC case and made it harder for the defendants to claim that their actions had been isolated incidents or legitimate military operations. 6 months after the preliminary hearing, the first concrete results began to emerge. The European Union imposed sanctions on all 9 defendants, freezing their assets and banning them from European territory. Several major corporations severed ties with Blackwater defense contractors, leading to a collapse in the company's stock price and forcing Marcus Webb to resign as CEO. More importantly, the governments of Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Honduras established Truth and Reconciliation Commissions to investigate the full scope of operations in their territories and provide support for survivors and families of victims. These commissions were granted access to David's files and began the process of documenting thousands of cases that had never been officially acknowledged. Carmen Delgado was appointed to the Guatemalan Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and when I spoke with her by phone, her voice carried a strength I hadn't heard before. "For 40 years, I have been trying to tell people what happened to my village," she said. "Now finally, my government is listening, my country is listening. The world is listening. Your husband, he made this possible." But perhaps the most meaningful validation came from an unexpected source. Dr. Elena Martinez, David's oncologist, contacted me 9 months after his death, with information that had been troubling her since his passing. "Sarah, I need to tell you something about David's cancer," she said during a secure phone call arranged by Jennifer. "I've been reviewing his case, and there are aspects of his illness that never made sense medically." She explained that David's cancer had progressed with unusual rapidity and had shown characteristics that were inconsistent with natural disease progression. More significantly, tests performed shortly before his death had revealed the presence of compounds in his blood that shouldn't have been there, substances that could potentially trigger rapid cancer development. "I can't prove anything definitively," Dr. Martinez said. "The tests I ran weren't specifically looking for poisoning, and too much time has passed to conduct more detailed analysis. But Sarah, I think you need to know that David's death may not have been natural." The revelation was both devastating and validating. Devastating because it confirmed my worst suspicions about the people we were fighting, that they had murdered my husband to prevent him from revealing their crimes. Validating because it meant David's decision to preserve the evidence had been prescient. He'd understood that his life was in danger and had taken steps to ensure the truth would survive him. Dr. Martinez's information was turned over to the ICC investigators, who added David's death to their inquiry. While proving murder after so many months would be nearly impossible, the pattern of deaths among people connected to these operations was becoming too obvious to ignore. As the first-year anniversary of David's death approached, I found myself in Guatemala City, standing in a small memorial garden that had been created to honor the victims of the massacres documented in David's files. Carmen Delgado was there, along with dozens of other survivors and family members who had traveled from villages across the country. "We wanted you to see this," Carmen said, leading me to a stone monument that listed the names of confirmed victims. "Your husband's name is here too. He died trying to bring justice to our people." David Henderson's name was carved in granite, alongside the names of farmers, teachers, children, and grandparents who'd been killed during operations he'd helped to plan and execute. It was a profound act of forgiveness. These survivors had chosen to honor the man who'd ultimately helped reveal the truth about their suffering, rather than condemn him for his original participation in their oppression. "How do you forgive?" I asked Carmen as we stood before the monument. "We don't forgive the crimes," she said carefully. "We never forgive the crimes. But your husband, he chose differently in the end. He chose to help us, even knowing it might cost him his life. That choice we can honor." The memorial service was conducted in multiple languages: Spanish, indigenous dialects, and English, with speakers who shared stories about the victims and talked about the importance of memory in preventing future atrocities. When it came time for me to speak, I found myself thinking about my students again, about the power of stories to help us understand our moral obligations. David spent the last 20 years of his life learning that true patriotism isn't about protecting your country's secrets, I said. It's about protecting your country's values. He understood that America is strongest when it acknowledges its mistakes and works to make amends for them. The crowd included not just survivors and family members, but also journalists, human rights workers, and representatives from multiple governments who had come to show support for the ICC investigation. It was a powerful demonstration that the world was watching, that these crimes would not be forgotten or ignored. But even in this moment of commemoration and hope, the security concerns remained. Marcus Chen and his team maintained a protective perimeter around the ceremony, and I was escorted to and from the event in an armored vehicle. The people we were fighting had demonstrated their willingness to use violence to protect their secrets, and that threat hadn't diminished with the ICC investigation. 2 years after David's death, the ICC trial finally began in earnest. The courtroom was packed with survivors, journalists, and legal observers from around the world. The defendants sat behind bulletproof glass, flanked by teams of expensive lawyers who had spent months filing motions and appeals. The prosecutor's opening statement was devastating. Dr. Okafor methodically presented evidence of systematic crime spanning 4 decades, involving operations in at least 8 countries and resulting in the deaths of thousands of civilians. She walked the court through David's documentation, explaining how his meticulous record-keeping had preserved evidence of planning meetings, budget allocations, and operational reports that proved the defendants had knowingly targeted non-combatants. But it was the survivor testimony that gave the case its moral weight. Carmen Delgado took the stand on the 3rd day of the trial, and her account of watching soldiers murder her husband and son was delivered with a dignity that left the courtroom silent. When she was asked why she had waited 40 years to pursue justice, her answer was simple. "I never stopped pursuing justice. I just finally found someone who would listen." 17 other survivors provided similar testimony, each one adding details to a picture of operations that had been designed to terrorize civilian populations into submission. The defense attorneys tried to paint these witnesses as unreliable, their memories corrupted by time and trauma. But the consistency of their accounts, supported by David's documentation, made their credibility impossible to dismiss. The trial lasted 18 months. The defense strategy was to argue that the defendants had been following orders in legitimate military operations authorized by the United States government. They brought in former government officials who testified that these operations had been necessary to prevent communist insurgencies from taking control of Central America. But the prosecution was able to demonstrate that the defendants had gone far beyond any reasonable interpretation of their orders, deliberately targeting civilians who posed no military threat. David's files contained communications showing that the defendants had known they were violating international law and had taken steps to conceal their activities from their own superiors. The verdicts were delivered on a cold February morning, exactly 3 years after David's death. 7 of the 9 defendants were found guilty on multiple counts of crimes against humanity and war crimes. Marcus Webb received a sentence of 30 years in prison. General Patricia Hawkins was sentenced to 25 years. The others received sentences ranging from 15 to 20 years. 2 defendants were acquitted on technicalities related to their specific roles in command structures, but even they faced civil lawsuits and international sanctions that effectively ended their careers and froze their assets. Everything after this becomes the conclusion for crimes committed during covert operations. The response in the United States was predictably polarized, with some celebrating the victory for international justice, while others condemned the ICC as an attack on American sovereignty. But for the survivors, the verdicts represented something more profound than legal accountability. They represented recognition that their suffering had mattered, that their stories had been believed, that the deaths of their loved ones had not been forgotten. Justice is not about revenge, Carmen Delgado told reporters after the verdicts were announced. Justice is about truth. Justice is about making sure these things never happen again. As I watched the defendants being led away in handcuffs, I thought about David's letter, about his hope that someone would know how to use the information he'd preserved responsibly. The convictions were a vindication of his faith, proof that bearing witness to injustice could eventually lead to accountability. But I also knew that this was only the beginning of a longer process of healing and reform. The ICC convictions had exposed the existence of networks that had operated with impunity for decades, but dismantling those networks would require sustained effort by multiple institutions over many years. The Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in Central America were documenting thousands of additional cases. Congressional investigations in the United States were examining how these operations had been funded and authorized. International human rights organizations were working to establish new oversight mechanisms for military contractors and intelligence operations. Most importantly, a new generation of survivors and activists had been empowered by the ICC convictions to continue fighting for justice. Young people in Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Honduras were organizing to ensure that their countries never again allowed foreign operations to target their communities with impunity. 3 months after the verdicts, I returned to teaching. The school district in Virginia had been reluctant to take me back, given the international attention my case had generated. But a private school in Maryland offered me a position teaching literature and human rights education. My students were different from the teenagers I'd taught before David's death, more worldly, more politically aware, more interested in understanding how literature could help them make sense of moral complexity. We read books about characters facing impossible choices, about people who had to decide between personal safety and ethical responsibility. Mrs. Henderson, one of my students asked during a discussion of To Kill a Mockingbird, "Do you think Atticus Finch would have kept those files secret if he'd been in your husband's position?" It was the kind of question I'd been grappling with for 3 years, and I wasn't sure I had a definitive answer. "I think," I said carefully, "that Atticus would have struggled with the same questions David struggled with. The difference is that David had 20 years to figure out what the right thing to do was. In the end, he chose justice over safety. Even though it got him killed? Even though it got him killed." That evening, as I graded papers in the small apartment I'd rented near the school, I received a call from Jennifer. She was working on a book about the ICC case and had been interviewing survivors and legal experts about the long-term implications of the convictions. "Sarah," she said, "I've been thinking about David's letter, about his decision to trust you with this information. Do you ever wonder why he chose you instead of someone with legal or journalistic experience?" I'd wondered about that many times over the past 3 years. I think he knew that I would approach it as a moral question rather than a political one. Someone with more experience might have tried to negotiate, to find a compromise that protected some people while exposing others. David wanted the whole truth to come out. And he knew you well enough to understand that you wouldn't be able to live with keeping the secrets once you knew what they were. That was probably true. David had lived with me for 23 years, had watched me struggle with ethical dilemmas in my teaching, had seen how I responded when I thought something was unfair or unjust. He'd known that I would be incapable of walking away from evidence of suffering that I could help address. As I sat in my apartment, surrounded by student essays about moral courage and literature, I thought about the unexpected path my life had taken. 3 years ago, I'd been a suburban high school teacher whose biggest worry was lesson planning. Now I was someone who'd helped bring war criminals to justice, who'd given voice to survivors who'd been silenced for decades, who'd become part of a global movement for accountability and human rights. The transformation hadn't been easy. I'd lost the quiet life I'd built with David, the security of anonymity, the comfort of believing that evil was something that happened far away and long ago. But I'd gained something too, the knowledge that ordinary people can make extraordinary differences when they choose to act on their moral convictions. David's greatest gift to me hadn't been the evidence he'd preserved, though that evidence had been crucial for bringing his collaborators to justice. His greatest gift had been his trust that I would know what to do with the truth, that I would have the courage to bear witness even when it was dangerous to do so. And perhaps most importantly, he'd shown me that redemption is possible, that people who participate in evil can choose to spend the rest of their lives working for justice, that atonement is a daily practice rather than a single act, and that the most powerful form of patriotism is the willingness to hold your country accountable to its highest ideals. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, delivered to my office at the International Human Rights Education Center in Washington, D.C. The return address showed it was from Elena Vasquez, a young woman from Honduras, whose village had been documented in David's files, but who hadn't been part of the original ICC investigation. Dear Mrs. Henderson, my name is Elena Vasquez. I am 24 years old, and I am a law student at the University of Honduras. I am writing to tell you that your husband's sacrifice saved my family. My grandmother was Maria Vasquez. She lived in the village of San Pedro when the soldiers came in 1984. She watched them kill my grandfather and my uncle, and she spent 35 years telling anyone who would listen about what happened. Most people didn't believe her. They said she was confused, that her memories were wrong, that these things didn't really happen. But because of the files your husband kept, because of your courage in revealing them, our government finally investigated what happened in San Pedro. They found the mass grave. They identified my grandfather's and uncle's remains. They officially acknowledged that my grandmother was telling the truth. My grandmother died 2 years ago, but she lived long enough to see her story believed. She lived long enough to see the men who killed her husband brought to justice. She died knowing that the world finally understood what happened in our village. I am studying law because of what you did. I want to help other families like mine find justice. I want to make sure that no grandmother ever again has to spend 35 years begging people to believe her story. Thank you for giving my grandmother the one thing she needed most. Someone who listened. With gratitude, Elena Vasquez. I set the letter down on my desk and looked out the window at the busy street below. The International Human Rights Education Center occupied a converted townhouse near DuPont Circle, and from my second-floor office, I could watch the constant flow of people going about their daily lives. Commuters heading to work, students walking to class, tourists exploring the city. 5 years after David's death, the world had changed in ways both visible and subtle. The ICC convictions had triggered a wave of accountability efforts around the globe. Truth and Reconciliation Commissions had been established in 8 countries. International oversight of military contractors had been strengthened. New protections for whistleblowers had been enacted in multiple legal systems. But perhaps most importantly, a generation of young people like Elena Vasquez had been inspired to pursue justice for the victims of state-sponsored violence. Law schools across Latin America were reporting increased enrollment in human rights programs. Journalism schools were offering new courses on investigative reporting focused on government accountability. Universities were establishing research centers dedicated to documenting and preventing crimes against humanity. The ripple effects of David's decision to preserve evidence were still spreading, creating waves of change that would continue for decades to come. The documentary premiered at the Sundance Film Festival on a snowy January evening in Park City, Utah. The Vault Keeper, a true story of secrets and justice, had been in production for 3 years, directed by Maria Santos, a filmmaker whose own family had been affected by operations documented in David's files. As I sat in the packed theater watching actors portray the events that had consumed my life for so many years, I was struck by how the story had evolved in the retelling. The film focused not just on the crimes that had been exposed, but on the ordinary people who'd found the courage to demand accountability, survivors like Carmen Delgado, journalists like Jennifer Torres, and reluctant heroes like me who'd stumbled into history-changing roles. The actor portraying David was younger and more handsome than my husband had been, but he captured something essential about David's character: his quiet intensity, his careful attention to detail, and the weight of secrets that he'd carried for so many years. During the Q&A session after the screening, a young man in the audience asked the question I'd been expecting. "Mrs. Henderson, do you ever regret your decision to reveal those files? Your life would have been so much simpler if you'd just destroyed them." "Simpler, yes," I replied, "but not better." My husband spent 20 years living with the knowledge of what he'd been part of, and it haunted him every day. He could have taken those secrets to his grave, but he chose to trust me with them because he believed that justice was more important than personal peace. After the screening, I was approached by a teenage girl who introduced herself as Carmen Delgado's granddaughter. She was studying at Stanford University, she told me, majoring in international relations with a focus on human rights law. "My grandmother used to tell me stories about you," she said. "She said you were the woman who helped the world listen to our family's truth. I wanted to thank you and to tell you that I'm planning to work for the ICC when I graduate. I want to help other families find justice the way you helped ours." Standing in the lobby of a movie theater in Utah, talking to a young woman whose grandmother's courage had helped convict war criminals, I felt the profound satisfaction of knowing that David's sacrifice had created something lasting and meaningful. The university auditorium was packed with students, faculty, and community members who'd come to hear my lecture on moral courage and the responsibility of witness. At 71 years old, I'd officially retired from full-time teaching but continued to speak at universities, conferences, and human rights organizations around the world. My hair was completely gray now, and I needed reading glasses to see my notes. But my voice was still strong as I told the story of a suburban high school teacher who'd discovered that her husband had spent decades documenting government crimes. The most important lesson I learned, I told the audience, is that ordinary people are capable of extraordinary moral courage when they're faced with clear choices between right and wrong. David wasn't a saint. He'd participated in operations that resulted in terrible suffering. But he spent the last 20 years of his life working to make amends, and he trusted me to finish what he'd started. During the question period, a graduate student asked about the psychological toll of carrying such enormous secrets. How did you cope with the knowledge that revealing the truth might get you killed? Fear is a rational response to real danger, I said. But fear can't be the only factor in moral decision-making. I had to ask myself, what would happen if I stayed silent? The people responsible for thousands of deaths would continue to live comfortable lives, protected by their wealth and influence. The survivors would never get justice. The families would never learn the truth about what happened to their loved ones. But weren't you tempted to just walk away? Every day. But I had students like you. Young people who were reading literature about characters facing impossible moral choices, who were learning that the most important moments in life are when we choose between what's easy and what's right. How could I teach those lessons and then choose the easy path when it was my turn to face that choice? After the lecture, I was approached by a professor from the university's journalism school who told me that enrollment in investigative reporting classes had increased dramatically since the documentary about David's case had been released. Your story has inspired a whole generation of students to pursue accountability journalism, she said. That evening, alone in my hotel room, I video called Lisa, who is now living in Oregon with her husband. Her daughters were both adults now, one working as a human rights lawyer in Guatemala, the other teaching high school history in Portland. Do you ever wonder what David would think about all of this? Lisa asked. I think he'd be amazed that his files led to so much change, I replied. But I also think he'd be proud that we chose to honor his trust rather than take the easy way out. The memorial service was held at Arlington National Cemetery on a crisp October morning, 20 years to the day after David's death. The ceremony was small and private, just family members, close friends, and a few representatives from the organizations that had been established to continue the work of documenting and preventing crimes against humanity. Carmen Delgado had died the previous year at the age of 91, but her granddaughter was there, along with Elena Vasquez, who was now a prosecutor with the International Criminal Court. Jennifer Torres, retired from active journalism but still writing books about government accountability, delivered a eulogy that captured David's complex legacy. David Henderson was a man who made terrible mistakes and then spent the rest of his life working to correct them, she said. He understood that redemption isn't a single act but a daily practice, that atonement requires acknowledging the full scope of one's actions and then working to help those who were harmed. As Jennifer spoke, I thought about the path that had led from David's deathbed confession to this moment of commemoration. The ICC had established a permanent division focused on investigating state-sponsored terrorism. Truth and Reconciliation Commissions had been created in 15 countries. International law had been strengthened to provide better protection for civilian populations during military operations. But perhaps most importantly, a global network of survivors, activists, journalists, and legal professionals had been created to ensure that crimes like those documented in David's files would never again be ignored or covered up. The letter was brief and handwritten, arriving at the assisted living facility where I now lived in Northern Virginia. The return address was from Guatemala City, and the sender identified herself as Dr. Carmen Vasquez Patterson, Elena Vasquez, now using her married name, and working as the chief prosecutor for the ICC's Central America Division. Dear Mrs. Henderson, I wanted you to know that today we secured convictions against the last 3 defendants from the Strategic Solutions International Network. These were men who thought they would never face justice, who believed their wealth and connections would protect them forever. They were wrong. The evidence your husband preserved 45 years ago is still helping us bring war criminals to justice. The methods he used to document crimes against humanity are now taught in law schools around the world. The courage you showed in revealing his files is still inspiring new generations of human rights advocates. Thank you for showing us that justice delayed is not always justice denied. With enduring gratitude, Carmen Vasquez Patterson. I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the wooden box where I kept David's original note and other meaningful correspondence from survivors and their families. The box was full now: letters from prosecutors and journalists, thank you notes from law students and human rights workers, photographs from memorial services and Truth Commission hearings. Each piece of correspondence represented a life that had been touched by David's decision to preserve evidence of crimes he could have taken to his grave. Each letter was proof that bearing witness to injustice, even when it's dangerous and difficult, can create ripples of change that persist for generations. As the sun set through my apartment window, I thought about my students, not just the teenagers I'd taught for 30 years, but the thousands of young people around the world who'd been inspired by David's story to pursue careers in human rights, international law, and investigative journalism. They were David's true legacy, a generation of advocates who understood that ordinary people have the power to demand justice, that moral courage is a choice available to everyone, and that the most important moments in life are when we decide whether to stay silent or speak truth to power. The documentary crew arrived on a Tuesday morning, setting up their equipment in the common room of the assisted living facility. The producer, a young man named Thomas Chen, Marcus Chen's grandson, explained that they were creating a historical documentary about the ICC cases that had grown out of David's files. "Mrs. Henderson," he said, adjusting the camera angle, "you're 91 years old. You've spent 30 years watching the consequences of your decision to reveal your husband's files. Looking back, was it worth the sacrifice?" I looked directly into the camera, thinking about all the letters I'd received over the years, all the young people who'd been inspired to pursue justice, all the families who'd finally learned the truth about what happened to their loved ones. My husband used to say that the most important choice any of us makes is whether to be bystanders or participants in the moral struggles of our time, I said. He chose to be a participant, even though it cost him his life. I chose to honor his sacrifice by ensuring that his witness would not be silenced. And the cost to you personally? I lost the quiet life I'd planned to live. I lost the anonymity and safety that most people take for granted. But I gained something more valuable. The knowledge that I helped give voice to people who'd been silenced for decades, that I helped bring justice to families who'd been waiting for answers for 40 years. What would you say to young people today who are facing similar moral choices? I thought about Elena Vasquez, about Carmen Delgado's granddaughter, about all the students I'd taught over the years who'd grappled with questions about courage and conscience. I would tell them that moral courage isn't about being fearless. It's about acting despite your fear because you understand that some things are more important than personal safety. I would tell them that history is made by ordinary people who choose to do extraordinary things when circumstances demand it. And what do you hope your legacy will be? I hope that people will remember that secrets kept in the service of protecting criminals become complicity in their crimes. I hope they'll remember that bearing witness to injustice is a responsibility that belongs to all of us. And I hope they'll remember that it's never too late to choose justice over comfort, truth over convenience. After the film crew left, I sat in my chair by the window, watching the seasons change outside. 30 years after David's death, his story had become part of the historical record, taught in universities, documented in films, referenced in legal proceedings around the world. But more than that, his story had become a reminder that every person faces moments when they must choose between silence and truth, between safety and justice, between the easy path and the right path. David had made that choice in a basement workshop, carefully organizing evidence that he knew might cost him his life. I had made that choice in a vault behind a water heater, deciding to honor his trust despite the dangers involved. And somewhere in the world, someone else was making that choice today. Another ordinary person facing an extraordinary moment, deciding whether to speak truth to power or look the other way. The cycle continues, as it always has and always will, with each generation discovering anew that the price of justice is eternal vigilance, and that the most powerful force for change in the world is the decision of ordinary people to refuse to be silent in the face of injustice. 3 years after David's death, I stood in my new classroom at the International Human Rights Academy in Washington, D.C. On the wall hung a photograph from the ICC trial, Carmen Delgado shaking hands with prosecutor Dr. Sarah Okafor after the guilty verdicts were announced. My students were different now, young people from around the world who'd come to study human rights law, many of them children of the survivors David's files had helped vindicate. "Mrs. Henderson," asked Maria, a student from Guatemala whose grandfather had been killed in the San Pedro massacre, "do you think my grandfather would be proud of what we've accomplished?" I looked around the classroom at these remarkable young people, future prosecutors, human rights lawyers, and investigators, who would continue the work David had started in our basement. Kaimar. "I think," I said, "that every person who died in those villages would be proud to know their stories finally mattered, that their deaths led to justice, and that you're here to make sure it never happens again." Outside the window, I could see the courthouse where Marcus Webb and his associates were serving their sentences. The network that had operated in shadows for decades had been exposed and dismantled. The survivors had their vindication, and a new generation was being trained to prevent such crimes from ever happening again. David's vault had been emptied, but his legacy lived on in this classroom, in the ICC's new protocols, and in the quiet satisfaction of knowing that sometimes ordinary people really can change the world. Class dismissed. Creating this investigative story required extensive research and countless hours of work. If you're finding this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more true stories.